Hi, it's Anna from Majestic View Nature Center, and today we're going to be talking about some earth sciences and some cool facts about our ecosystems. Did you know that you could be connected to ecosystems halfway across the world? The Savannah Desert, a very dry ecosystem, can produce so much dust that it affects us in the ways that we have our weather, the oxygen we breathe, and maybe even some snacks you have in your pantry. The Savannah Desert is a very dry ecosystem with a lot of dust. And all that dust gets swept up with the wind and all the weather into what's called gyres, these rotating sort of cyclones of air high up in the atmosphere. And those can travel all the way around the world. So millions of tons of this Savannah dust can fall into the Atlantic Ocean, where it feeds a lot of phytoplankton. And as phytoplankton photosynthesizes, it produces oxygen. About half of the world's oxygen is produced by plankton. So the air you breathe is affected by dust from somewhere in the middle of Africa. And that's not the only ecosystem that might be impacting your life or might be impacted by you. But first, what is an ecosystem? Well, an ecosystem is everything that's living and non-living together in an area. And all of these living and non-living things work together as a system and they form a community. That's what an ecosystem is just a type of community. So soil, rocks, wind, and air, along with all things living, including plants and animals, and even things like fungus, produce an ecosystem. But what defines one ecosystem from another? There's no real clear boundaries. Ecosystems are just as interconnected. When you go from one ecosystem to another, it's a very gradual transition because there are so many connections that make those two communities work together. Now, as all these ecosystems work together, there's many things in all these different ecosystems that can impact one another. And those impacts changes the ecosystems over time. One area isn't going to stay the same forever because there's so many new things and so many changing things from different nearby ecosystems. Even Colorado ecosystems haven't always looked the way they do now. Colorado millions of years ago actually used to be an ocean. All of this used to be underwater. And we know that because of fossils we've been able to find. And the ocean went away because two tectonic plates smushed together and formed the Rocky Mountain Range. The mountains we have all along our front range used to be a lot taller as those tectonic plates squished them up really, really high. Erosion has actually been another factor, and that has actually made our mountains shorter. Can you imagine our mountains being even taller than they are today? What about any other places that might have changed over time? Is there ever a place you visited when you were little or younger that looked way different than it does now? Perhaps it's more overgrown, or perhaps the amount of water's different. Or maybe that place doesn't exist anymore because it's been developed up with houses or markets and things that we need for our human communities. So there's lots of things that can cause all those changes to ecosystems. Like I said, erosion over time as water weathers away and moves all that soil downstream. Invasive species can also be another factor that can change ecosystems. As an animal from a nearby community joins this community, it can have an effect on what type of plants are still alive. Maybe it eats out a lot of other prey animals. Other weather events like droughts can also be a huge factor on changing ecosystems. There's a difference between weather and climate though. This is weather. Weather is something that happens temporarily. It's not always snowy around here, but where do you think it could be always snowy? Maybe the Antarctic or even the Arctic Circle. But here we have warm days and cold days. So this is just weather. Climate is something that persists over a long period of time. The climate is something that you can be relatively assured about what the weather might be like. For example, Colorado has a pretty temperate climate. We have sort of an average hot and cold temperature. But if you went to Antarctica, that's a polar climate. That's always going to be cold and snowy. And even humans have impacted our ecosystem and ecosystems nearby and all around the world. Plastic pollution is a huge problem that does have an impact on ecosystems. And a lot of you may already know about single-use plastics, such as plastic straws and plastic bags, and some of the impacts they have. But a lot of people forget about plastic that we have in our day-to-day lives that takes hundreds to thousands of years to break down. This has a huge impact on ecosystems as they can't cope with the buildup of all this plastic. Plastic from toothpaste containers to soap pumps to even food like peanut butter and just bottles and packages. All of this plastic stays in our ecosystems for a long time, especially when we don't put it in landfills. And as all this plastic enters our ecosystem, it may travel downstream or erode down into other ecosystems. And as it travels, it breaks into smaller and smaller pieces without ever actually decomposing. These smaller and smaller pieces form microplastic, and it kind of looks like just clear gooey sludge. That's what they mean when they say there's plastic in these giant patches in the oceans. It's not pieces of plastic you can just go pick up or skim off of the water. It's this sludgy, slimy plastic that makes it really easy for wildlife and plants to absorb, which then when we eat those plants or animals and fish and all that, we're eating that plastic too. So if you think about it, choosing plastic impacts us as well. But there's also ways that humans can have a positive impact on our ecosystems. We can pick up garbage that we see. We can also help restore habitats after severe weather. So if a hurricane comes through or a really strong drought, we can help mitigate some of those challenges for native species. Have you ever tracked how much plastic you actually use in a week? See if you can write down every single thing that uses plastic, from food to toiletries to just day-to-day activities. Anything that has plastic, write it down and see how much plastic you have in your day-to-day life. And then brainstorm and see how you can maybe reduce the amount of plastic that you use. Now, there's other factors that can affect an ecosystem as well, including what's under the ground. Underneath the soil, there's many different layers of earth, and those layers help impact what climates are available or possible on the surface of the earth. The surface itself is called the crust. The crust is this green outermost layer of the earth, and that crust is actually a really thin layer of the earth compared to everything else. The crust is only 3 to 40-ish miles deep, depending on where you're at on the surface. Think about it. Mountains are really tall, it's a thicker crust. But there's also things like volcanoes that can have a connection to the next layer. The next layer is this red, molten, almost liquid kind of molten rock layer. That's called the mantle. The mantle is the thickest layer. That layer is over 1,800 miles thick. Inside the mantle is the outer core and the inner core. Now the inner core is only about 700 to 800 miles thick, and the outer core is only about 1,500 miles thick. But together, along with the mantle and the crust, they are what make up Earth and all of the ecosystems living on it. So from the inside of the planet to the outside and all the ecosystems around the world, we hope that you understand that you're now connected to everyone and all the living things on the planet, and even some of the non-living things. See if you can follow any of the project prompts or investigative prompts in this learning unit, and we hope that you have fun learning about Earth. Until next time, take care.